the same area, we need to support you. And that's how it started. But a few weeks after the strike, like 2 weeks after the strike, women started formally organizing, forming an organization that's called Sikhala Sonke, to support the workers, but also to make visible what they have been doing as women in Marikana. So I think there's multiple ways in which they've been organizing.
Thanks, Asanda. Yes,
my name is Jim Nicol. I'm a lawyer for the wives, the sisters and the mothers of those miners who were killed at Marikana. And I've witnessed over the past 2 years the most remarkable transformation in the women who have come from the Eastern Cape to the Commission. When they first arrived in November of 2012, it wasn't by invitation of Zuma who told the nation that they could contribute nothing as they were not there. And it wasn't by the encouragement of Farlam who, contrary to our submissions, commenced the Commission without the women being there at all, and then went off on an inspection and trampled all over the ground upon which they had been killed. But when they arrived, they were completely and totally isolated. It was, they were only allowed one person per family to come. They didn't know the other women who came to the Commission, and there was much weeping and much sadness. It was really, it was awful. I remember the Christmas of 2012 having a little service before they set back to the Eastern Cape with Bishop Sioka, where people were, the women were crying on the floor really, and singing "Abide with Me." But that has changed. I mean, it was quite remarkable. They would sit there in silence, not saying very much. And then came the first commemoration, and we had to try and persuade one of them to stand up on the platform in front of 15,000 miners and to say something on behalf of the families, and we didn't know quite how we were going to do that. And we had a meeting the night before to see if we could find a volunteer. And so we explained what they had to do. And then we were sitting at the front, a bit like you're sitting there now, and one person walked up, grabbed a notebook, wrote the name and said, "I'm speaking." Then by the time 15 minutes had passed, 8 women had marched to the front and said, "I'm speaking." And Mrs. Gwalani is the woman who spoke, and she stood up in front of 15,000 miners and shouted "Amandla." And we knew things had changed since then. They'd sat in that commission listening to Farlam and other people referring to them as being unsophisticated and uneducated. By God, they got their comeuppance. And more recently, we've had what we call family presentations, in which we wrote down what they wanted to say about their loved ones and the impact that the killings had had upon their lives and upon their families. And the idea was that we'd read it out, that the lawyers would read it out. And then Farlam said, a big mistake for Farlam, he said, "Is there anything else that perhaps you might like to add?" And over half of them spoke, and you can't imagine the courage at which these people sat in that commission, in a room a bit like this really, and spoke. And 2 or 3 of them, one of them, Joseph Matunja, sitting next to me, was sort of sitting opposite there. And she spoke about the devastation of their lives. But the idea is, they said, "We blame Longman. Longman didn't negotiate. Why did you not negotiate?" I mean, full of ideas. I mean, the whole commission was completely shocked that these people had any ideas at all. They'd sat there and treated them like dirt for the past 2 years. And then they would turn, this woman turned, and she says to Joseph Matunja, "Mr. Matunja, I beg of you, you stay strong. Our people died for 12,500, and that's what you must fight for." And then another one came and said, "I now want to address the workers in this commission, the workers who all come from London each and every day." And she said something very similar. And so the transformation of the women over this past 2 years has been quite remarkable. And of course, in this past week, they've all been shipping up at London saying, "We want our medicals, we're coming to work here." So it has really been absolutely fantastic.
Thanks for that contribution. It's very good to hear. Gavin.
Well, what I've got to say does actually follow on from Jim, because what you're describing here, Asanda, so well is a story actually which is familiar on a global plane. of the way in which, particularly mining communities, but other sorts of communities as well, on the one hand, women play an absolutely intimate role, of course, in the reproduction of labour power. It's labour power which is being reproduced, the same with the capacity to labour and refurbished on a daily basis, and how the rhythms and changes within the labour process actually then come and affect that realm in the community and in the home. But also as well about how they're politicised and mobilised through strikes. And Jim and Margaret are worth talking to after this, because they will have very strong memories of exactly how this happened in the Great Miners' Strike in Britain in 1984 to 95, where, to stylise facts, you began with a situation where women were playing a broadly subordinate role, I would say, within the politics of those mining communities, and by the end of the strike were leading it. And actually, to my friend, sitting in front of me, I must say, were on the front lines of the pickets battling the police. So they clearly didn't know their place. So there are no universal laws, of course not. So I think it's worth thinking that this is part of a broader global working class experience. It's worth thinking about that. But at the same time, it's one which has specificities to South Africa and to Marikana, and these were the two sort of points I wanted to raise more for discussion. Obviously, within the presentation you've given, you've concentrated on the detail of Marikana, and that's absolutely right. But it is part of a bigger story, two very big changes. One, of course, is just the reconfiguration within the migrant labour system, and the role of women and the role of the reproduction of labour power within that. And I wonder whether you could reflect on that for us a little bit more. Moving from the sort of, with its classical form, developing in the late 19th and early 20th century, with women providing some sort of agrarian subsistence in rural areas to subsidise cheap labour power, which is being sent to urban centres. And all of this is getting reconfigured now. And I think these are massive changes, actually, structural changes within our economy and within our society, which we don't understand particularly well. And you probably more than most have looked at the intimate details of that. So that's the first thing I wonder whether you could speak about more. And then the second thing as well was, you mentioned it in passing, but I think it's actually worth drawing out as a more significant factor perhaps, which is the fact that the Unkanen settlement, where you've been working, next to the copy there, is actually on a piece of land which is registered to a tribal authority, to the Baba Tribal Authority. And as you said in your presentation in passing really, the women are struggling to get the degrees of authorisation that they need to pursue certain sorts of things. Now this is really important, because actually what this is pointing to is that there's a large section of the working class, both men and women, in that community who somehow are disenfranchised from a set of basic socio-economic rights which other South Africans and other parts of the countries are able to get. In other words, there's a legal division within, if you like, the working class itself, which has made that category of workers and their communities and the women within them far more vulnerable to various forms of oppression and exploitation of the type of which Marikana has shone a spotlight. And this again is part of the reconfiguration of the classical shape of the mining industry as it moves out of the old white urban centres into the former homeland areas, which in fact what Marikana is. So perhaps you could talk about that a bit more as well.
Thanks for the presentation, Asanda. Mine is a simple one. You know, in your presentation you portray a very positive picture about how mine work shapes women's lives. But I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges that these work rhythms bring in the home, and how are these addressed? For example, are these women always trusting when these men say they're going to work?
Can you switch off your light? Thanks. And over here there's there's all of that. Okay, I'm going to go on this side. Then we come here, and then we'll come back to Asanda and then there'll be another round.
Okay, thank you. My name is Kenny Mabasa. I'm just a private citizen. Or status. Yeah, look, for those of us who really grow up in the townships, mainly in the 80s, you can easily relate with the Marikana situation. Alexander, Soweto, so that really resonates very well with some of us. which lead me to, my few questions. One, I'm really interested in parallels between Marikana and South African society as a whole in general today. So how much does Marikana really resembles South Africa in general? That's really the first question. The second question is really how do we prevent the Marikana situation from happening again? And perhaps lastly, because we hear mainly the emphasis of the relationship between Eastern Cape and Marikana. I'm just really interested about, to know whether there are other people who come from elsewhere in Marikana as well. It's just Eastern Cape. Thank you.
Right, Asanda.
Thanks very much for the questions. I think I'll start from the bottom up. The parallels between Marikana, I also grew up in a township, and I'm not sure if there's really lots of similarities between Marikana and some of the townships. I think similarities in the sense that, like in the sense of everyday life. I think the situation in Marikana is very dire. It's terrible. People don't have basics, and I know that some people in townships don't have basics, but I think there's something that's very dire that's happening in Marikana. I'm not sure if I would necessarily say that similarities, but in terms of parallels, just general parallels, is that with the rest of South Africa, is that people in Marikana, they don't have, again, basics, I think, and it's a common story. I mean, we see protests, service delivery protests across the country, so it's common in that sense, it's a parallel in that sense, but I think when you look at the nuances, there's a lot of, again, differences. Because of where Marikana is located, a place where there's mineral wealth, yet people are living in dire poverty, So I think there's similarities, but it's just on the surface. When you get down, when you go deeper, there's not a lot of similarities, I think. How do we prevent Marikana? I think part of what I think I was trying to say today was that when we're talking about Marikana, we should not only focus on the production issues. The whole story of Marikana, I think for me, is actually on the reproduction space. It's actually in the home space, and if we ignore the home space when we're talking about Marikana, we're going to see other uprisings around Rustenburgs, other strikes around Rustenburgs. So I think the reproduction space and how people's dignity is just not, the government just does not respect people. But in Marikana, it's not just the government, it's local authorities, tribal authorities. So you have people, for instance, who want to access healthcare. And they go to the clinics in Marikana and they're told, sorry, we can't help you. You don't understand our instructions in Setswana. Come back when you can speak Setswana. So there's things like that in this South Africa. And I think there's something, So I mean, how do you address that? Because that's part of the Marikana story. The reason these women supported the workers is because they could resonate with the ways, with exploitation, one, but also the way they are treated like dirt in their communities, and the workers are treated like dirt at work. So I think there's you said something, I forgot the last one.
Well, it's just really the dominant narrative emphasize the Eastern Cape people.
Oh yeah, are there other people in Marikana? Yes, there are other people in Marikana. In fact, lots of the tuck shop owners are not from the Eastern Cape. A lot of them are from Mozambique, and some are from Malawi. So there's a lot from also the northern Cape. No, not Northern Cape. Limpopo. There are Shangans and Xhosas, therefore, in the area, and those divides are very important. But also sometimes they try organize as the disenfranchised, the ones who are excluded. And I think that leads me to Gavin's point about just what's happening in Marikana. Oh, maybe before going to Gavin is Tabang on the challenges. I mean, do these women not trust their men? I don't know. I didn't really explore issues of trust per se. But yes, there are challenges, and those challenges, I think that's what I was trying to communicate, is that the challenges at work translate to challenges in the household. Women are having to put in extra work because of what's demanded at work from their men. Women are having to make sacrifices at home in order for their men to be at work and be productive workers. So I think there are challenges even in the household. that are brought in because of men's work in the mines. And then Gavin, I think the questions you asked are very big. I'm not sure if I can address them here, but yes, there's been obviously the fact that the land is owned by Bakuba Mokhale in Rustenburg, I think it's affected so many other small things, well, big things in fact, that it's affected who gets jobs and who doesn't get jobs, who is a local and who's not a local, and if you're a local, you have certain privileges, and if you're not a local, you're also excluded from those privileges. But I don't think it's just the fact that but also even national politics come into play. So you'll have privileges that are given just to people who support the ANC, because Marikana has changed quite a lot. I think it talks to your point about politicization of people in Marikana. So there's been a shift from ANC support to EFF support. NUM to AMCU. In a way, those two belong together, EFF, AMCU, ANC, NUM. So people so also, again, there's privileges that are just for those who continue to support the ANC. And those who support EFF or any other political parties like the UDM are completely excluded from those things. So if women want, for instance, to get a proof of residence and they go to the local office, they are asked, who do you support? Do you support ANC or do you support EFF or UDM? And because they know that a lot of people support these other parties and not the ANC, they're not given proof of residence. And